So, before we start, you might assume from the title of this video that I hate or that Far Cry 4 itself is a bad game, but that is far from the truth. I personally love this game, as it improved on many aspects of Far Cry 3 and is arguably the best main antagonist of the franchise. But there are certain negative aspects of the game that are rarely discussed, dissected, or critiqued, and how these aspects are the main culprit as to why the franchise has started to stagnate. So let's find out exactly what Far Cry 4 did to cause the doom of the franchise. Oh, and quick disclaimer, this video will be full of spoilers regarding Far Cry 4 and some of Far Cry 3, so be warned. For most of its early years, the Far Cry franchise constantly evolved and innovated itself, never staying in the same place twice. The first two installments lacked the modern Ubisoft formula, so at a glance, you would not think that Ubisoft had anything to do with the games. Alright, I cheated a little bit here since Crytek actually made the first game, but the second game was from Ubisoft proper. And what I mean by the franchise having historically continuously innovated between each installment is how the first game took place on an island like Far Cry 3, and still it was more of a parody of a bad spy or action movie where the game starts off fighting mercenaries but starts to throw in mutants later in the game. Yeah, mutants.
What is this? A bad spy movie? You two are gonna get us all killed!
It's probably the game that shared the least DNA with the franchise, but it is the game that put the franchise on the map. The second game went in a completely different direction, away from the lush jungle and into the unforgiven savanna somewhere in Africa. And gone was the parody, action hero movie stuff and comedic style. Instead, it would be a hard-hitting, depressing and complex subject to be explored in the second installment. It's a unique setting as few games takes place on this continent. The gameplay was brutal to say the least. No HUD, no crosshair and barely any stealth, and enemies that packed a punch and reacted realistically. The story itself was depressing, but in all the right ways. The world was nuanced and it asked some really tough questions regarding post-colonialism and how many of the problems are on the naive Westerners who donate money and goods which the local warlords steal and sell to others. However, it was not a game for everyone as it was a little bit too hardcore, and many casuals just put it off. And the next game would be far more forgiving and make things more user-friendly to get a broader audience. And let's just say, they succeeded. Far Cry 3 is when the franchise was close to perfection. It made many changes from 2, including the HUD, map, giving you a radar on the map and what direction your objective is at. And it was more user-friendly and forgiving, no more malaria pills. And you could say it's more of a traditional FPS experience. The setting was once again a jungle, just like Far Cry 1, but it would be more of an isolated story with a vast narrative focusing on Jason and his journey, which was quite rare for many shooters to have during this time, since many tended to ignore the story and characters in favor of action and spectacle. But the most significant thing about the game was the introduction of Vaz, as it did something not a lot of games had done before, which was to put so much effort and time into its antagonist. The performance by Michael Mando was astonishing, and this would become a staple for the franchise. The game also tells a beautiful and serious story regarding identity, transformation, and what type of person you're willing to become to save others and yourself. The symbolisms of the game in its dream and hallucination sequences were masterfully crafted. The game works primarily due to the protagonist and his journey, while at the same time having an interesting counterpart, which is Vaz, and how these two characters interact with each other and how Jason is becoming more like Vaz, as his own personality is slowly being eroded by the jungle. Most people still see Far Cry 3 as the best game in the franchise, but the question is, where should the franchise go after this? There were some plans to continue the Far Cry 3 story in the next installment, which I wonder how would they do this, as the game does not really leave any loose ends and you can't really take the story any further. So they scrapped that idea early on and Far Cry 4 came to be. But the game shared many elements from 3, hence the game is often called Far Cry 3.5, and they are not entirely wrong. But it was also this game that broke the tradition of going in a new direction and instead played it safe, which would create consequences for the future. However, the game learned some of the correct lessons and improved certain elements such as replayable outposts, more weapons, the hunting was improved, and the side activities was much better. Still, it failed to adapt other components of Far Cry 3, and even the whole franchise to this day has not learned the proper lessons from Far Cry 3 yet. So, let's explore these issues that Far Cry 4 started. When people talk about Far Cry 3, people tend to always end up talking about Vaas's great performance, and I agree, again, that Michael Mando was extraordinary and his performance should be praised. Still, there are so many people that ignore Jason, and I think most just don't care about him or understand his journey and how with every single step he's losing himself more and more, becoming more insane. His mannerisms are changing, and the duality between Jace and Vaas, which is interesting, is how they are both trapped in this cat and mouse game and how Jason is slowly becoming more like Vaas in order to become strong and survive. And when Vaas dies, he will continue to live on inside of Jason as Jason has become so much like Vaas. And Far Cry 3 is great because of this duality between the protagonist and antagonist. But this is completely thrown out of the window in Far Cry 4, where the entire narrative is now solely focused on Pagan, the antagonist. And this is a disaster of a narrative as AJ has too much history and is not a no-name silent protagonist, because Pagan is actually AJ's stepfather. And this realization should invoke many thoughts inside of AJ as to why did his mother not tell him about this and what does that make him? It's just too bad that he does not react to this discovery at all. It would have been an interesting dynamic if AJ's whole worldview changed the more of his history was revealed throughout the game, and how much of it is the complete opposite of what his mother told him before she passed away. Like, come on, how does he only barely react when it's revealed that his mother had a loved child with Pagan and that he has a sister, and how his mother killed his father? Like, it would break most people's minds. They would have to rethink their whole life and especially reconsidering their love and relationship with their mother if something like this was revealed, and most would just go completely crazy. And again, it's just weird that AJ has so much history in Karat, but he's basically a silent protagonist. And it's not to say that having a silent protagonist is a bad thing in a game, because in Far Cry 2 we also play as a silent protagonist who is a mercenary. However, this character worked compared to AJ because the person we play in Far Cry 2 is realistic in terms of being a mercenary who came to Africa to make money. He has no allegiances to either warring faction. He plays both sides to get paid the most, and towards the end of the game he understands all the pain and suffering he has caused and he wants to help clear the sins he has committed here. And this is all conveyed through actions and other characters, and it works because you can suspend your disbelief due to the setting and narrative. But in Far Cry 4, AJ is not a completely silent protagonist, but he does not act like he's the main character either. It's like the developers could not decide what to do with him and they just said screw it. And it's actually not that far off, as something did change in the development. The lead writer, Mark Thompson, said that they cut over 80% of AJ's dialogue, which starts to paint a clearer picture of the story that AJ was supposed to react more to what's happening in the game. But I think the developers were worried about the player and critic reception, as one of the main critiques of Far Cry 3 was how loud and obnoxious Jason was in the game, and they did not want to risk creating another Jason, which was for the worse. Far worse. Because the main issue is that AJ never changes throughout the game. He's the same person at the end as when he started his journey. For example, he's able to kill people in the first time you get some gameplay action, and there is no revelation as to why he knows these skills. We don't really get to know anything about AJ before he came to Kyrat. And for some reason, the more information regarding his parents and their relationship with Pagan, he barely reacts when he finds out, as said earlier, that Pagan had a child with his mother. And this narrative had great potential, and it was all squandered. It's insane. It could have been an interesting story regarding identity, since AJ has lived most of his life in America because he escaped with his mother from Kyrat when he was only 3 years old, so he has no memory of that place. And when he gets there, everyone starts comparing him to his parents, while he has no real stake in the country except his main goal, which is spreading his mother's ashes besides Lakshmana. But seeing him coming there, and he starts to appreciate Kirati culture, trying to find himself, and accepts his heritage. It would have been a far more interesting narrative, but nope. Nothing there. And this lack of duality between AJ and the different characters spread throughout the game, and especially Pagan Min, would also infect every later installment, because after Far Cry 3 there would no longer be any significant focus on the protagonist, as they would become less prevalent in the narrative, with the main focus being now on the antagonist instead. And pretty much every protagonist would now be silent. It was only in Far Cry 6 that we finally got a talking protagonist. Hell, they are the most talk-active protagonist ever in the franchise, but they missed one key ingredient: the duality between the protagonist and the antagonist, because Danny and Castillo do not meet that often, and most of what we know about Castillo is from his point of view in different cutscenes, which Danny does not partake in, so he does not know this, so they are not building up this relationship towards the resolution between these two characters. So again, I don't understand what Ubisoft is doing here. It's like they have not learned anything. Because they would pull this shit if you would be playing a silent protagonist, because it's often that the antagonist is talking to you, the player. But no, here it's just there. And excluding Far Cry 6, every other protagonist is a silent protagonist, more or less. An issue with this is that there is no journey or a hero's journey, because the character starts the same and ends up the same, and there is no real transformation in between. One of my other critiques is that every character now has to be a native to the land where the game takes place, and this of course due to modern sensibilities and how several journalists criticize Far Cry 3, and especially Jason, for being the white savior trope, which is so far from reality it's unreal. But the company took that critique seriously, and the lead writer Thompson, again, even said that the most important thing about Far Cry 4 was to make the protagonist native to the land. I agree that having native people as protagonists is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But it does slightly eliminate the fish out of water character arc to explain this new world or place. And the fact that in so many later Far Cry games they explain apparent things that the protagonist should know because, well, they are native to the land, and it's pretty ridiculous. And this is why it's better to have a non-native person as the protagonist in an unknown place, because they need to adapt to survive, learn this new place's customs. And it even loses its identity in terms of its main title, as Far Cry means a far cry from home, so somewhere unknown, far away, and this can't happen if the protagonist is native to the land, so it's pretty much loses its identity on just this. And I know what they mean by this. They mean that how we, the players, are far from home. But really, far from home in Montana in Far Cry 5? Weird. And be it antagonist or friendly faces, Far Cry 4 has too many characters and not enough screen time for all of them to be fleshed out. The allocation of screen time between these side missions are so out of context, and they have nothing to do with the main story. And the characters that suffers the most from this are Pagan's lieutenants, who lack so much screen time. Paul Deplore is only shown in one cutscene at the start of the game before we turn him over to the Golden Path, and there is probably 6 hours between these 2 scenes, and the main mission structure is all over the place. And the issue I have is how the main story jumps between so many different people and missions, which makes you lose this build up towards the final confrontation with said character. Far Cry 3 did this super well when it came to Buck, where his main mission storyline makes you do maybe 4 or 5 missions in a row with him, which expands on his character and shows you just what type of person he is and how he has his own story arc, and you can feel the building frustration and tension between both him and Jason, and how it comes to a boiling point by the end. Killing Buck feels so satisfying due to this structure, and there are no distractions in between these missions. It's clear cut. And compare this to Noor in Far Cry 4, who is a side character, or rather side antagonist, just like Buck. We meet her after being drugged by Jogi and Reggie, and we get thrown into the arena that she controls. And we make it out alive, and Noor explains how she needs AJ's help to rescue her family, whom Pagan has, and how she's not really a bad guy. Well, we do maybe 3 or 4 missions with other people before coming back to her, where she wants us to do a mission for her, and then we go away and do 3 other missions, and then we come back and kill Noor. Like, whoa. The disconnect between her missions and other missions in between completely disconnects my involvement and intriguement with her character, as there is too much space between her scenes and the build-up, and it's nowhere near as satisfying as when killing Buck, because when she dies, you feel nothing for her. And then there are also the side characters, which are fairly useless, as 2 main side quests, Jogi and Reggie, have 7 cutscenes in total, and Longilus has 5, and it feels like such a waste, as these characters get a lot of screen time, and they're not even related to the main story, which makes me wonder why they did not cut these characters' screen time in favor of giving them to the main characters, especially the villains like Noor, Deplore, and Yuma, as we only see Deplore twice, Noor 3 times, and Yuma twice. And Yuma is Pagan's right hand, and there is no build up to these confrontations, and killing them don't feel satisfying. And this is also due to narrative, as AJ has no real beef with 2 of these people. Paul even likes AJ by the end. Noor did not really care about him. Only Yuma hates AJ because his mother corrupted Pagan and made him weaker, according to her. And in comparison to Far Cry 3, Jason had a clear relationship with the other characters. You knew why he hated Vaz, Hoyt, and Buck, as they killed his brothers, tortured his friend, and how they are causing so much suffering on the island, and of course how they are trying to kill Jason. The hate Jason has for these people feels realistic, and why they hate Jason is also obvious. I have no idea about AJ's relations with any of these characters in the game. I don't know who he hates, I don't know who he likes, and I don't know who is in the middle. There are no realistic relations being set up in the game, because either the screen time is too small or it's just wasted potential. As I mentioned, there are 7 scenes with Jogi and Reggie, and the cutscenes have no substantial growth in them. We don't learn more about these characters, it's just padding? The only character that works is Pagan, but that's because he's always close to AJ in terms of the radio calls he makes with him. I'm not sure if these issues are due to the huge cast. All I know is that in future installments it becomes even worse. And this is especially true in Far Cry 5, New Dawn, and Far Cry 6, where there are so many characters, which makes it hard to differentiate and care for the side characters, and you never really build a bond with them, as their screen time is not nearly enough and it's limited. The franchise should go back to a smaller and tighter cast like in Far Cry 3, and have the main story be more linear so we don't jump between quests. Give us 1 villain and we focus only on them for 5 missions or more. Come on, Ubisoft. Ever since the drug scenes from Far Cry 3, they have become a staple of the franchise, as they are in every single game. And my main gripe with this is that it actually served a narrative purpose in 3, while it's only made as a spectacle in the other installments. Let me do another comparison to Far Cry 3. Yeah, we're getting a lot of those, but it's important. You are drugged multiple times throughout the game, and we get a look into Jason's mind, his backstory, traits, personality and fears. We see why he's such a natural with guns. We see that he's this daredevil, but he has no direction in his life. We see how his mind is slowly starting to disintegrate, and he starts to forget where he's from and who he is. The corruption of the jungle is also present, slowly engulfing his mind, and ultimately he has to make the final choice to either stay or leave the island. While in Far Cry 4, we barely see anything when we are drugged, and it's just wacky nonsense when it's with Yogi and Reggie. The only scene that actually serves a narrative purpose is towards the end in the boss fight with Yuma, where she drugs AJ and he sees either Amita or Sabal, and how they will eventually do the shit at the end when they are in command of Kerat, and how Yuma keeps on revealing more information regarding Pagan, your mother, and how much she hates AJ. But there's nothing about AJ. He's just a passive listener whom does not react to any of this, exploring his inner struggles or who we are. What does he feel? Has he changed? It's just a stark contrast between these two games. They just copy-pasted the sequences from 3 because people liked them, but they did not understand why people liked them and how they help to flesh out the main character. No other Far Cry game has learned this lesson, and it's just visual spectacle without any real substance. As I stated at the beginning of this video, I like Far Cry 4, but I'm not oblivious to the game's shortcomings and how it created different factors that had long-term consequences for the franchise. Most of the games will start to feel the same, and you can always feel that Ubisoft formula, especially when it comes to side activities and the open world, which is filled with mindless tasks. I just really hope that the next Far Cry game looks back at what made the franchise great in the first place. Bring back interesting protagonists with their own stories, journeys, feelings, and their duality and interactions with other characters and the antagonist. Make the cast smaller and try to develop the characters more and their relations with the main character. Don't just throw in random hallucination scenes, make them matter. Let us learn more about our protagonists that we play, and don't be afraid to let them talk a lot. And lastly, please stop with the protagonist has to be native to the land where the game takes place. I want to see characters out of their depth and how they need to adapt to the unknown country's traditions or die trying. And remember what the term Far Cry used to mean. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm currently working on the Far Cry Primal video, but I want to really talk about this topic as it's something that a lot of fans tend to ignore, and I genuinely want better Far Cry games in the future as I love this franchise. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and comment down below if you agree with these takes or if I'm completely and utterly wrong on every level. I also have a Patreon, so check that out. So see you in the next one, guys. Have a good one.